as I think about it, there are a lot of different ways F1 wins this weekend, obviously for the drivers, the teams, the fans, the city itself. What does success look like for the owner of the product as this weekend unfolds?
Well, I think it's a huge win for Formula One in many ways, starting with the fans, the chance to get to show them what's going to be an awesome track, an awesome experience out there at the Hard Rock Stadium. Our partners, the Miami Dolphins and Tom Garfinkel, have built a great experience. I think that'll be the first place it's a win. I think it's a win that the track is going to be interesting for racing. It's a highly abrasive surface. They used a natural recycled product. It's going to be highly abrasive on the tires, so there's going to be a lot of tire strategy involved and figuring out how long you can go on softs, mediums, hards. So that'll be interesting, keep it competitive. For us as an economic proposition, Miami's a great showcase. We really invested and bought Formula One on the basis that there was enormous opportunity in the United States. The Austin race has gone from being something that had a hard time selling 80,000 tickets a few years back to doing over 400,000 this past October. But Miami is going to be a whole nother level of showcase, going to be a whole other level of excitement. And I think you're going to see that exhibited both in the TV audience and in the general level of interest. The number of articles that have come out about the event, the number of articles that have come out about where Formula One is going. It's even the cover of Business Week Bloomberg, or is it Bloomberg Business Week? I never remember this week. So
Bloomberg Business Week.
So I got the order right.
But you're right. A lot of press has come out around the event, but not all of it positive. There has been some criticism from people within F1 or I suppose outside F1 now, formerly CEO Bernie Ecclestone, saying that you're risking the sort of purity and the traditions of the sport by overly Americanizing it. Is that fair?
Bernie has to say something. If any of you know Bernie, they know that's how he operates. Look, Bernie deserves massive credit for building the sport. He built an enormous juggernaut, but the reality is it didn't move forward in our judgment over the last few years, and the audience was stalled. Bernie's line was, I like old rich white guys to pay for the sport, and our view has been that there's an opportunity to be much broader, to bring in gender diversity, to bring in age diversity, and I think that's worked out well. And I'm willing to take Bernie's criticism.
Okay, but he was an economic animal. The US always existed. There have always been petrol heads here. They tried and failed quite spectacularly to crack the US market under the previous ownership. So what is it this time that you guys are doing differently? How have you tweaked, dare I say, the formula or Formula One to make sure that the US is a success this time around?
Well, I think the numbers speak for themselves. As I said, we went over 400,000, which was the largest Grand Prix in history. Last October. This will be over 300,000, and frankly, they really, our partners constrained the audience and constrained the attendance because they want to make sure they got it right in the first year. I suspect it'll be bigger in future years. There clearly was more demand, and now we've launched Las Vegas to a lot of acclaim, which will start in November of 23. What did we do differently? I think we've invested. Maybe it helps that we are an American company, but we've invested the time in building out a great experience. We've done a lot to try and open the sport up. It used to be a fairly closed sport, very little containment, very little product was released. Now we have, we're the fastest growing sport on social media. We've had fan experiences. For example, a few years back, we had the cars drive through Trafalgar Square and attract 100,000 people to come see it in London. Of course, the drivers were supposed to just drive around passively around Nelson, and they all did donuts. So it was, that kind of stuff is natural and what you want to see. We've seen obviously the growth of things by opening up, like the Netflix Drive to Survive series, has caused us to expand the audience. And I'd like to hear fans, thank you. All of those things have been a big positive, and consequently, as I mentioned, while at a time when other sports are aging, we can show by surveys that we've not only increased the gender, we've increased the average, or brought down rather, the average age of our audience in 3 years by 4 years, which is a huge accomplishment. And we're seeing massive increases in the viewership here in the United States, up 50% year over year, and then again another 20% this year. So in a time when a lot of sports, because of the changing nature of sports on television, are having declines, we're having quite the opposite.
How do you balance that sort of purity that I alluded to, and whatever Mr. Ecclestone may or may not say, there is an aspect of the sport that has always been about being at the very pinnacle motor racing, and therefore it has this sort of mystique, and to some extent that was maintained by being inaccessible. So how do you preserve that and then at the same time do what you were just talking about in terms of opening the sport up to a broader audience by making it accessible?
Well, I think we still have those high-end experiences. If any of you bought the Carbone dinner, or any of you are trying to go to the Paddock Club or the Palm Club, you know it's not exactly a low-end experience here, nor at anywhere else. And but we've also created opportunities for fans, both on television, streamed, or in other ways, to get the experience. And I think we've maintained that pretty well. Really, I think we tried to do a bunch of things which not only democratize the sport in that sense and opened it up, but we've tried to create a more interesting experience for the viewership. If you look at how the television has changed over the last few years, I think Sky does a very good job. I give them a lot of credit. And that's moved a lot over the last 5 years. If any of you watch the Indy 500, and I'm certainly not biased against it because actually we were investors and owners of the team that won the Indy 500 last year, but look at the difference in the coverage and how strong the F1 coverage is versus the Indy 500 coverage. I think you'd walk away thinking the F1 experience on television is a way better experience. We've done things to try and make the sport more competitive. The Concord Agreement is the relationship we have with the 10 teams, and we instituted a new Concord Agreement this year. It had, I think, 4 big elements which are going to make a better product over the long term. The first of those is we put in a cost cap. You had teams spending as much as $450 million and teams spending $125 million. And guess what? The $425 million team, in this case Mercedes, won for 8 years in a row, 7 years in a row. Constructor 8, Driver Championship 7. That's changed. Now this cost cap much more competitive. 2, we have a new design. These cars create massive downforce. Hugging the track allows them to do unbelievable things in terms of performance, but throw off a horrible amount of dirty air, meaning if you get behind one of these things, your ability to overtake is massively destroyed, limited, and very tough. The new car designs have less bad flow off the back, create an easier chance to overtake, and you've already seen some of the great racing that we've had where back and forth, which really had not happened over the last few years. Third, we leveled out how some of the money gets paid out. So we have a couple of big sources of revenue: broadcast, promoter fees, which is ticketing from people like our friends at the Dolphins, and advertising and sponsorship, some ancillary things like the Paddock Club hospitality. We collect all that revenue, we split it with the teams. And that was heavily stacked towards the winning team and towards some historical relationships like Ferrari got a big bonus. We've tried to level that out so that the midfield and lesser teams have a better chance to be competitive. And the last thing we did is we created them as franchises. So historically, there had been as many as 15 or 20 teams on the grid. It got down to 10. Right when we entered the sport, Manor, which was the 11th team, went into receivership, the UK equivalent of bankruptcy, and got sold for £1. Now the bottom team, because they're all locked in as franchises, is worth $400 million minimum, maybe more. And I think you're seeing numbers discussed as much as $1 billion for a team or $2 billion for a team. That attracted investment, that attracted interest. Again, make the bottom teams, the second and third tier teams, more competitive. So I think we're just at the beginning of seeing that happen this year. You've seen Haas, which was the laggard, do quite well this year. You've seen Ferrari come back. A lot of excitement and a lot more mystery to what's going to happen on a weekend, a lot more excitement about who's going to overtake and where. So all 4 of those things, I think, set up well to increase our fan interest as the years go forward.
Will we see the expansion from 20 teams up to, I think it's 23 has been talked about as a possibility? No,
you're saying, let's not confuse. There are 23 races, there are 10 teams, 20 cars.
Sorry, 10 teams.
Yeah. Right. Well, there's a potential that we may increase the teams over time. I don't think it's a pressing need. There are a lot of people who would like us to do it. Most of them want to buy in, but we have not felt that need. In some cases, there are actually problems. The paddocks, the garages, there's some places that really don't have more than 10 garages. So there are challenges literally around the dynamics of putting an 11th team on the track.
Obviously, the deal that you signed here with ESPN a few years ago, which has been rumored to be worth around $5 million a year, is going to end this year. As you talk about the popularity of the sport and how much that's increased and how much the sort of the television product, if you like, has improved, what are you thinking in terms of where that deal could go? I mean, could this be a $100 million a year brand? Could it be bigger than that? What's the sort of analog we should look at for F1?
Well, that's a good kind of number. We'll see how it goes. We're going to see a massive increase. Again, we're one of the few sports that's had this explosion in audience. And we were historically very undermonetized, historically cheap. We'd like to be less cheap. We'd like to obviously provide good value to our broadcast partners, but I think there's a real opportunity to see that increase.
And what does that look like? Would you consider going over the sort of, when I think about, I guess, the options there, you could go down the traditional TV route, which will give you more eyeballs, but perhaps a lower check on the way in, or you could do something more like what boxing has done, where you go to an over-the-top product, which might give you a very, very good amount of money coming into it, but potentially lose you some of those eyeballs longer term.
Look, we own a baseball team, pretty successful one, so we pay attention to the breadth and making sure as wide an audience can see your product, and that's true for all sports. It's particularly acute here because we have a big advertising and sponsorship component. So Heineken and Rolex and the like, they want to make sure we're not on a narrow cast way as well. It is interesting how the world fragmenting, you think about cable households and how many there are, and then compare now with how many Netflix households and how many Prime households. The idea that the broadest audience was historically on television or on cable, that's becoming a lot less clear. And if you look at the trend lines over the next 5 years, that's going to be a lot less clear. Those lines are going to cross. We come from cable as our history. We watch that well, but that's not where the growth is today in terms of video.
Would Netflix be a logical buyer for the content, bearing in mind the success that they have had with Drive to Survive?
You'll have to talk to Reed and Ted. Reed has made the smarty line that he wished he'd bought the company. We'll see if he gets a chance to just rent the product, but we'll see.
I did mention the potential to increase the number of races on the calendar. Obviously, you're now going to have 3 in the US, which is unprecedented. No other country has more than 2 currently. Which other markets might you look at in terms of expanding the sport with a race?
Look, I think we have a careful balance. We have a lot of demand from a lot of places. We are truly a global sport. The one continent where we are not operating, put aside Antarctica, is Africa, and we've looked hard at Johannesburg, and I think that's a real potential till we could be on every continent, and a lot of reasons to be there. I know Lewis Hamilton would love us to get to Africa, and Lewis is our biggest star, so we certainly listen. But there's also demand more demand in Latin America. There's more demand in Asia, and then the historical European races fight for their position on the calendar as well. So this is a somewhat of a balancing act between your historical audience, trying to make sure they're happy, tracks with a lot of iconic history, and new tracks where in some cases we're getting better economic deals, and we're also opening up a new fan base.
Talk to me a little bit about the decision to keep racing in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, there is a lot of controversy surrounding that country. There have been accusations of sports washing around other sporting events there. You already have the Middle East with the Bahrain Grand Prix. So I wonder, why stay there? What's the decision that sort of drives that?
Well, it's not always easy to choose the politics of the places where you race. We have people who are not very pleased that we're racing in China. They weren't pleased that we were racing in Russia before we pulled the race, obviously, after the Ukraine incident. There are people who are not pleased we're racing in Bahrain. And there are people, frankly, who are displeased we're racing in America, tweeting about Roe v. Wade being overturned. So we are never going to satisfy all of the interests, political interests of everybody there. I think the Saudi, my estimation, Saudi is a society that can improve like many others, and they're actually making some progress in good ways.
You mentioned some people not delighted that you're racing in America. I mean, look, Miami, Florida, I should say, generally has been through some issues itself recently with the bill that was passed, the Parental Rights in Education bill, and obviously Disney have been sort of foremost in being caught up in that as a company. Has that impacted at all the decision to hold a race here, or the decision to potentially hold the race here in future years?
Fortunately, no one has ever asked me the question. You're the first person to mention.
Well, that's good. We get the exclusive answer.
Yeah. As I said, no one's ever asked me the question. I don't feel the need to answer. So it's.
I think it's a fair question, isn't it, for a media company holding an event in Florida at this time? Such a big and prominent event?
Yeah, I really don't think that's, again, if we responded to every political complaint that went on, we'd race nowhere. You know, Norway maybe. Everybody happy with Norway?
I'm sure they have their own issues as well. You mentioned Lewis Hamilton as being the biggest star. Obviously, there were some complexities, let's say, to how the season was decided last year. How concerning was it for you as the owner of the F1 brand when it looked like he may not return to the sport and he took a sort of hiatus from even discussing his future in it?
Well, I consider Lewis a friend, somebody I have a lot of respect for. I can understand why he was as shaken by what happened and why he was as disappointed. And, you know, Lewis endures, as many athletes do, a lot of scrutiny and a lot of second guessing and a lot of spotlight. And so I think his chance to go and, you know, revitalize himself in private was well deserved. You know, would I have preferred a race where there was no controversy, there was no issue in terms of how it was decided? Absolutely. You know, I watch a lot of sporting events and I see controversy about calls quite frequently, and this was, I think, sort of the same.
In terms of growing the sport, obviously, when I think about sort of taking eyeballs in a sport, often it's taken from other sports. Where do you see F1 going in terms of market share? Is it after other motorsports? Is it after some of the bigger traditional sports in the US? Or what do you sort of dig into to actually get those new viewers interested?
Well, I'm not sure, you know, we're starting from a relatively small base. I'm not sure we're taking share so much from other sports. There has been a, you know, a hole, you could argue. I mean, NASCAR was massively hot several years ago and has not been as hot recently. I don't think we're taking share from them, but maybe there was a latent audience that was interested in motor racing. But I really think when you look at these younger viewers who really had our growth, you know, we may be, you know, taking share from TikTok. I don't know. We're not. I don't think we're really stealing a lot of market share out there yet.
So we put a Twitter poll out there, which Bloomberg did this, I should say, which asked the question: what is the best way for Formula One to continue to grow its US fan base? And 39% of people said it was to attract Gen Z fans. 46% said more races in the US, and 14%, I should say, said increase the number of teams. I think we've talked about increasing the teams. We've certainly talked about having more races in the US. But talk to me about the Gen Z fans and how you
Did you offer them these choices?
I believe they were offered these choices.
So if you put up 3 choices, somebody's going to choose all of them, right? I think we've already done 1 and 2. Now, is there more we can do? Absolutely. Not more races in the US, but we're going to have a 3rd race, so we're on that one. Gen Z fans, I think things like Netflix, the esports we do, the social media we do, all of that has been a big factor in growing our Gen Z base. And actually, that is probably where we've grown faster than anybody else recently. So actually, I think that part's going okay. Increase the number of teams. I honestly think that's probably an American team that did well, American driver that did well, American OEM, all those would be interesting. But just another team, random, put an 11th team in, I don't think that's going to add a lot to the audience per se.
What can you do as owners to actually try and encourage that, to try and encourage, you know, as you say, whether it's a US driver, team, OEM, how do you get them more into the sport? Because presumably that would help boost things over here.
So, look, the reason why these drivers are so good and why it's hard to imagine someone just getting in one of these cars is, you know, I was with David Coulthard on another panel. He was a driver from the 90s and 2000s who, very amusing character. But he said he started karting at 3. And, you know, what we have kids throwing a football or perhaps a baseball, maybe now they're picking up a lacrosse stick. These kids are in motor carts for racing at 5 and 6. And we don't have that program here in the United States. Now we've started it, and the teams have started it, and I credit, for example, Red Bull has a big program to try and grow younger drivers. But we just don't have that depth in the U.S. And as you know, someone once said, if you start with 10,000 kids at the top and pour them through, you're going to kick out 1. So when we have 10,000, you know, starting at 5, our chances to get 1. Well, we don't have near 10,000 not starting at 5, but that's what will build a U.S. driver base. And the other reality is it's only 20 drivers, so it's not a huge, you're not talking about the 1,000 baseball players there are, right?
Is there any, I suppose, possibility for a U.S. team to come over from some of the other U.S. open wheel sports, Indy or whatever else, or are they just not competitive in the same way?
Look, you get a diversity of opinion. I think you could get a U.S. team, and that's true. Would one of those drivers translate across? There's a diversity of opinion. Some people think that some of those drivers would be great. Other people are less sure.
Just moving away from F1 before we wrap up, you're one of the few businesses left that have a special purpose acquisition company undeployed, which is pretty good because the market has obviously been so bad recently that the opportunities presumably are a lot better now in terms of cheaper assets. What can we expect there? Where are you sort of looking with that SPAC?
Look, our experience, our strength historically has been in a lot of subscription businesses, a lot of consumer-facing brands, a lot of experiential things. Remember, we're a big shareholder in Live Nation, Ticketmaster. We own the Braves. We own Formula One. We think we have knowledge of that experience, and there's probably some opportunity to cross-promote and do things which are positive. But we'll see. You're in a world where the markets have crashed in a lot of places, but the expectations of sellers may not have moved as quickly. So we'll see if those two things come together and we can get something done.
Can we see you do something in esports?
I think esports is very interesting. We do have entrants. For example, as I said, Formula One has a big esports component. We've done some other things. We're a small investor, not exactly, but in the drone racing league. So, we've done some different things. They're not scale big businesses to date. So, we tend to try and do something larger that'll move the needle. That would be the SPAC alternative. Our SPAC is pretty big for a SPAC. So the opportunity has to be a pretty big opportunity relatively.
We'll watch this space. We will keep checking in on it and see where it gets to. Greg Maffei, great conversation. Thank you so much
for your interest in Formula One.